The year is 941. The situation for the Catholic kingdoms of Western Europe is dire. The right to divine rule is based on the legitimacy of the papacy, but Catholicism had suffered horrendous defeat after horrendous defeat. The crusade for England had been shattered, and the kingdoms of Europe were once more embroiled in infighting, at a time when enemies at the borders gained in strength year by year. What's more, during the crusade Rome had fallen into the hands of the Muslims, and the papacy had to flee to the castle town of Viterbo further north. But one man had undying resolve. In 941, he called on the Catholic kings to carry forth the spirit of the Holy Trinity once more, and unite under the banner of the cross to take back Rome from the heathens. The beautiful Pope, as Innocentius II would later come to be called, was sure of success. He sent for the Catholic armies of confidence. It was his last bid to save the Western Christian heritage. He knew Catholicism was on the brink. The Crusade for Rome tells the story of a pope determined to restore his institution to its rightful place. But it also tells the story of a new age for Western Europe in general. The collapse of the Calling Empire had left the Catholic kingdoms weak and fractured. Now, after more than 100 years of infighting between the Calling successors, it was time for new houses to take center stage in Central Europe. House Smile originated in Savoy. They had long suffered under the constant Calling successor wars, as the lands were located at the crossroads between those kingdoms, and thus became a regular battleground for the armies of Europe. The Kingdom of Italy was always particularly disunited under the threat from heathens to the south and east. Naturally, its weakness was abused by its neighbors, and there was never any longer period of peace for the nobles of Italy. In many ways, House Smile was like any other ducal house in the Catholic world. They participated in the First Crusade and lost friends and family in the vain attempt to take England. They suffered from the constant infighting between the Calling successors, rampaging for each other's lands in hopes of reuniting the Calling Empire, and they had become skeptical of the Pope and his very authority. Just like all other houses, they wanted one thing above all: stability after a century of war. During the First Crusade, Duke Jacob of Savoy would meet Duke Boquin of Corsica and forge a strong and lasting friendship. When they returned to their realms after the defeat in England, they would continue to exchange letters and occasionally even visit each other. House Bra, a word derived from an ancient Corsican term for brother, ruled over Corsica and parts of Sardinia. Unlike the houses of the mainland, it was mostly spared the hardships of the successive wars by fortune of geography. In return, it had been hit by Viking raids during the First Crusade multiple times, and upon his return, Boquin did not only find his lands plundered, but his family decimated. Soon, both houses would ascend to higher things, and decide Europe's very destiny. When the beautiful Pope called for the Crusade on Rome in 941, both houses had successfully revolted against the former Calling kings and established a kingdom for themselves. House Bra ruled over the barren lands of Corsica and Sardinia. The region was known to be poor and was exposed to Viking raids from Circland as well as Muslim invasions from the south. Burgundy, the realm of House Smile, on the other hand, was a prosperous region. The court of House Smile was multicultural. They had long-lasting familial connections to the Byzantine Empire in the east, and thus hosted a variety of guests and scholars. Naturally, the response to the Crusade differed for both kings. While King Boquin of Sardinia welcomed the chance to drive back the Muslims and the heathen Duke of Spoleto from Italy, House Smile was less enthusiastic. Due to their multicultural influences and the relative safety in Central Europe, they themselves questioned the Pope's authority and were known sympathizers with the Orthodox Church in the east. At first, King Jacob refused to answer the Pope's call to arms. It was only when his old friend and fellow crusader King Boquin sent for his help that King Jacob pledged his troops to the crusade. Who knows how different our world would look if he hadn't. With the combined armies of the Mediterranean Catholics, the crusade for Italy was swift and decisive. The Mandean Duke of Spoleto was executed and the papacy restored to Rome. But instead of stopping there, Boquin and Jacob forged an alliance to drive the heathens from Italy. Together they went from victory to victory, securing Sicily and eventually even landing in North Africa. The Italian campaigns, as they would later come to be called, secured central Italy permanently and ultimately helped the Pope and his believers reaffirm their right to power. But while the Pope and the mighty kings of Western Europe were caught up in wars to secure Catholicism's most holy site, the kingdoms at the border regions suffered. Without support from the safer and stronger European kingdoms, they had to fend for themselves in the borderlands to the west and east. Asturias fell, and Ireland and Scotland struggled to keep the Vikings from advancing any further. The conflict was also bound in the exposed kingdoms of East Francia and Bavaria. with a massive border crossing the entire European continent and traditionally weak kings, the Catholics of Germania were on their own. No pope would come to save them. They had to find a new approach. While the relatively powerful Catholic kingdoms of the Mediterranean were off to recover Rome, other Catholic kingdoms were struggling with the same problems as them, but without the hope of the Pope intervening on their behalf. Under constant threat from the pagan kingdoms of Pomerania, Bohemia and Poland to the east, the German kingdoms of East Francia and Bavaria were in a precarious situation. These kingdoms had been weak for the better part of the 10th century, since strong independent duchies held most of the power in their lands. Responsible for protecting their own lands against the Viking and other pagan raiders, these duchies often fielded substantially larger armies than their own kings. No duchy is more of a symbol of this time than the Duchy of Hesse. The House of Nassau was a house of its time, more powerful than their own king, fiercely independent, and constantly caught up in the kingdom's affairs as if they were their own. What's more, as the distant Pope lost power and interest in the region, House Nassau of Hesse had to find a way of dealing with the pagan invaders on their own, and in doing so, found a different approach to pacifying the pagan threat: diplomacy. Over multiple generations, the House Nassau would keep close ties with the kings of Pomerania, and occasionally even intermarry with the Vitalists. Completely unheard of, and outrageous to most other Catholic regions, this was in fact not totally unusual for Germany at the time. Both the pagans to the east and the German duchies were more threatened by the Vikings to the north than each other. Neither could rely on a powerful faraway ally to come to their aid. Forging alliances was more of an act of necessity than an expression of kindness. The resulting cultural exchange was initially just a byproduct. Just like other powerful duchies of Germany, Hesse shied away from actually claiming the king's throne. It came closest during the reign of Baldemar of Hesse in the late 11th century. But the throne had no appeal to many dukes of East Francia. Helplessly powerless, the kingdom would only burden the house with military and financial liabilities rather than strengthen it. To the south, on the other hand, the dukes of House Sigmaringen were constantly vying for the Bavarian throne. Unlike their northern counterpart, faced with abandonment from Rome, they did not grow close ties with their pagan neighbors. In the absence of a common enemy in the form of the Vikings, the Germans of the south took a more violent approach. They would spend the better part of the century fighting pagans to the east in a constant back and forth struggle. The Kingdom of Bavaria was similarly weak to the Kingdom of East Francia, and despite its efforts, House Sigmaringen was not able to claim the realm and stabilize it so they could face the pagans as a united front. But while the German dukes dreamed of a stable kingdom, people elsewhere were reaching for different stars. A distant fantasy had captivated the minds of the powerful. A mystical realm, distant, mighty, all-powerful. The century of empires had begun, and in a warm Corsican summer night, a boy was dreaming a dream of Rome. Cyril Bra was born in Vecchio, Corsica on August 4th, 981. His childhood wasn't easy. His father died a year after his birth, closely followed by his grandfather King Salinguerra of Sardinia, making Cyril king at the mere age of 3. The Kingdom of Sardinia had expanded its reach in the last 50 years. After the Crusade for Rome, the Pope was unable to pacify the new Muslim population of Rome. When mobs took to the street, he called for the aid of the closest kingdom, Sardinia. Sardinian troops secured the city and were granted permission to stay by the Pope in exchange for keeping the peace. The new kingdom also expanded south all the way to the island of Sicily, driving the Muslims from Italy entirely. But with the death of King Salinguerra, hard times were about to fall on the realm. Not only was a 3-year-old child now king of Sardinia, his uncle, King Grandler, inherited the southern part of the realm and was crowned king of Sicily. As a result, Cyril grew up in hiding. His advisors feared his uncle might try to kill the boy in an attempt to claim the Sardinian throne. So Cyril grew up mostly alone and isolated, often reading by himself for hours on end. As he grew from a boy to a man, he was physically weak and sickly, often having the court worried that he would not even live to see his 16th birthday. Matters were made worse when his cousin came to the court and reportedly bullied and beat up the young Cyril on multiple occasions. It is said that Cyril could hear the voice of Caesar speak to him. Today it is believed that this is more than a mythical metaphor. Historians believe that Cyril had suffered a severe psychosis or even schizophrenia, owing to his upbringing, and that he indeed heard voices speak to him. Whether it is true or not, Cyril claimed the throne in 996, shortly after turning 16. He was given a shattered and weak realm, barely worth the title of kingdom. Weakly, and often socially awkward, he was looked down upon by the other kings of Europe. But he had a vision to unite Christianity against the surrounding threats, a vision of greatness revived, a vision of a new Roman Empire. First, he reaffirmed all alliances. When a Hackamid army tried to invade Provence, he sent the Sardinian troops to the aid of his grandfather Boquen's allies in Burgundy and defeated the Muslim armies. With the help of Burgundy, he then reclaimed the island of Sicily and banished the Shadow King of Sicily to Malta. The term Shadow Kingdom refers to the Kingdom of Sicily, which continued to exist on the island of Malta, led by the descendants of King Grendler for the next 500 uninterrupted years. For Cyril, this simply meant he had established himself as the true heir of the House Bra. He quickly began to put his dream of Rome into action. In 998, the garrison that was left behind in Rome to support the Pope was ordered to fly Sardinian banners instead of those of the Vatican. Much to the dismay of the Pope, Cyril proclaimed Rome an integral part of his kingdom and started to move his court to the Eternal City. In 1005, the young king moved on to change the political landscape of Europe forever. He assembled an army to invade the kingdom of West Francia, justifying himself with a claim coming from his mother's side. He swiftly defeated the French king and claimed victory in 1007. He had a vision to unite the realms spanning France and Italy into a new Roman Empire that would easily beat back the Vikings to the north and south. In his mind, he would first need to prove himself worthy of claiming the title Imperator. But once he did, the kingdoms of Aquitaine, Burgundy and Italy would fall into line and rally behind him as the rightful emperor, ruling from the city of Rome. The conquest of France, as Caesar had done a long time ago, was his way of asserting that claim to power. But the kingdoms of Europe still laughed at the so-called Little Emperor. While his claim would eventually lead to other realms to try and assert a similar continuation of the Roman legacy, starting the century of empires, the other Catholic kingdoms were mostly amused by the delusions of the one they mockingly called Island King. Cyril would spend the next 20 years doing everything humanly possible trying to prove himself worthy of the title Imperator. First, he took part in the crusade for Galicia to recover the sacred site at Santiago. Then, in 1022, he established the Knights Templar in one of his personal holdings in Corsica to position himself as the man who funds the armies of Christianity. When this also left the other kings unimpressed, he took more decisive steps. The Dukes of France had spent the last 20 years in almost constant rebellion against their new king, not accepting the bizarre Corsican as the rightful ruler. To prove his worth to them, he invaded the Viking kingdom of Brittany in 1023, ending his conquest in 1026. Finally, in 1031, the kings of Europe had to begrudgingly accept that the Island King had created the most powerful realm in the Catholic world. Cyril saw his ambitions fulfilled when the Pope agreed to crown him Imperator Romanorum, and Cyril henceforth referred to himself as Emperor of the Sacred Roman Empire. It was his greatest success, and would have long-lasting implications for Western Europe for hundreds of years. But unfortunately for him, the kings of Europe would still not yield. History might have taken a different course if Burgundy would have been integrated into the empire. But when Cyril visited the court of House Smile to negotiate integration to the empire, he was quickly taken aback by the sophisticated and multicultural atmosphere of the court. House Smile in return found that they had nothing to gain by rallying behind the rough and fanatically Catholic Cyril. In the end, Burgundy did not join the empire, and with it, the option of coercing the other kingdoms into joining faded away. It was here that Cyrus' dream was revealed to be an illusion. Europe of 1030 was not ancient Rome, and the independent kingdoms of different culture had no inherent need to submit to an emperor reigning from a faraway city. Cyril never learned that lesson, and would continue to fashion himself as Imperator Romanorum. He spent most of his remaining life fighting the rebellious dukes of France and patrolling the Catholic borders, pretending they were his borders to patrol. He would find his end much the same way he spent his life. In 1051, the Pope called for another crusade, this time to secure a Catholic kingdom in the lands of the Rus to the east. Cyril eagerly went on the crusade, which quickly turned into a disaster in the forested lands of Ruthenia. Cyril was captured near Minsk in 1055, and died chained up in a Russian chieftain's tribal village in 1056. And so ended Cyrus' dream of Rome. But the future was still uncertain. Emperor Story followed Cyril on the throne and completed the move of the capital to Rome. But the realm was unstable, and new contestants quickly gained in strength and repute. Cyril's sacred Roman Empire was only the first in a series of realms that claimed the title of empire for themselves. From the mountains of Marrakesh to the highlands of Scotland. From Granada to Constantinople, the century of empires had begun. Which will fall, and which will stand the test of time? And would any of them truly reclaim the Rome of old? Like and subscribe to find out in the next episode of the Grand Campaign.